What's up, friends? Stopping that for now. Ken here. It's been a little while. I should fix my camera a little bit because I'm looking kind of weird. But I was trying to leave things open because I have been sick the last couple weeks, and it's been nice to have the sun in this room and keeping things nice and bright and healthy. Hello out there. I know that it's been a little while, so I wanted to take some extra time this week to really get into the couple of things that dropped while I was sick, talk a little bit about the production process, try to do all the cool things that I do when new songs come out and things happen. And it's been a busy week. Actually, this is going to accompany, especially on my YouTube, the release of Factory of Hope. For those of you that haven't heard it, that was the song that started this stream as we were broadcasting here. And if you ever have any questions or something that you want to know or something that you'd like to see on these streams or with anything that I'm doing, please ask them in the chat, either here or on YouTube. I know. And if you like this, what am I supposed to say? Smash the subscribe button to bits. Like, throw your mouse into the computer, subscribe, ring the bell if you like cool music stuff. If you like what you hear, you can find The Silence Noise everywhere that finer music is found. TheSilenceNoise.com is the best place because that links you to everywhere. So you can pick your preferred music service, whether it's Spotify, iTunes, Google Play, Deezer, Napster. Napster is my favorite one. I think the fact that Napster still exists is almost so mind-blowing to me. Like, I kind of forget that that's even possible, that Napster still exists. But Napster still exists, so if you, for some reason, are still using Napster, maybe some of you are catching these tracks on Kazaa, you're downloading them on LimeWire, you're on BearShare, wherever you are right now, listening to music. If it's 1998 and you're downloading on some dial-up, wherever you are, that's awesome. I'm done with this rant. I lost it. I lost momentum. That's what happens when I get sick and when things change. But what I wanted to do, what I like to do is, as I'm building these tracks, I like to share a little bit more, but since I haven't had a chance to do it, and most of this stuff was coming from my phone or from other sources and things that I was doing right here, I wanted to give a little chance to break things down. So the song that started this week was based off of the theme of digital, which for me is not necessarily that interesting of a theme. I actually struggled a little bit the last couple of weeks to come up with some ideas because the themes weren't really doing it for me. The last 3 weeks themes, we had distortion, we had analog, and we had digital. So those 3 themes really were focused around the practical effects that you were using. I tend to, especially since I'm learning a lot of my mixing techniques and I'm working on a lot of different things, like digital is pretty much always part of everything I do. In fact, what you're seeing when I'm sharing things here is all about the digital stuff that I'm doing as part of the process. I'm gonna turn my mic up a little bit. I think it might be a smidge too quiet. I turned it down in the past, and I just want to make sure that you can hear me, especially once I start playing music and I start doing the stuff that I'm doing over this. But I like to share a little bit about the technique. I like to share a little bit about the process. And so Factory of Hope, in some ways, is kind of a spiritual successor to My Feet in the Mud, which I did a couple of weeks ago. And in fact, for those of you that listen to My Feet in the Mud who haven't checked it out on YouTube or Spotify or wherever music is, you'll find that the end of this song actually has a callback to My Feet in the Mud with the part that I did at the end. In fact, I'll play that part right here as I move over to share my screen and talk about what we're doing here. But My Feet in the Mud is actually in the end or in the final break here. You'll know
so much but care so little, always searching for the newest arrival.
Actually, part of what I tried to do when we were creating that theme and what we were doing here is there's an interesting transition from the end part here, and I'll show off what's happening there a little bit in a second, but there's a funky transition that got called out whenever I was sharing this on Reddit or anywhere else that talked about the transition in key between the 2 songs.
But care so little, always searching for the newest.
So we move into the key of that song because, again, for me, this is kind of a spiritual successor to that song. There's a lot of similar elements that are happening here, maybe on a future mix breakdown, since I wasn't doing these when I did my Feet in the Mud and started that whole process. I wasn't doing these types of mix breakdowns. I'm actually going to pull up my chat in case people are leaving there. Hey Diane, welcome. Talking through the latest songs. So whenever I start a mix, I'll talk a little bit to the writing process on this song. So I know that for me, especially for this song, which I'm going to go song by song, Factory of Hope really started with the bass line and the vocals alone. So when you really solo those pieces here, you'll kind of get the genesis for where the song started. And in fact, the song really started with the verse and the bass. So when we narrow down to those items.
My dreams are in a machine, downloading hope to a factory, assemble my life from a template.
And so one of the things that's interesting about that, well, the harmony vocals or the harmonization is normally something that I do at the very end, so there actually weren't. I have the folders narrowed down so we can look through all the tracks as we're talking about this, but actually the harmony parts were the very last thing that I recorded in this, and they're normally the very last thing I recorded. So the genesis of the song, when I blow this out a little bit, really was just around that bass part with just the verse and what we had there. So I think if I just solo that.
My dreams are in a machine, downloading hope to a factory.
And so I'll jump around to a little bit later in the song as well. So and then we'll add in the other instruments and what started with those and kind of break them down a little bit. And again, if you like this, especially on the YouTube, ask questions. Let me know what you want to know about when it comes to this song. But I'm going to break it down in the way that I was doing it during the writing process. So the verse is really where it started, and the bass line, because of that vocal part and where I started with the verse, really kind of expanded into the rest of it. So you had this part in the middle here. Oh, I need to unsolo my...
I can't see, my eyes are so tired. I can't believe with all of this information.
So normally every week, this is the part that drives me crazy. So my process is, normally a lot of times the idea will come to me in the morning, or it'll come to me when I'm walking around. And so the first thing that you'll get is humming into the cell phone. And the humming into a cell phone normally sounds nothing like what the final product is gonna be, but a lot of times it's me working out vocal concepts. So you get like a lot of da 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 that's coming in there that eventually comes out in a vocal part. And normally these days, the process has normally been, once I have that part, the bass is the first thing that comes out, which again, I know for a lot of songwriters that I'm finding who are in the song a week process with me, is that a lot of times the beat or a piano part or a bass part will be what starts it. For me, it's almost exactly the opposite. What starts it almost every time, is the vocal part that I'm working on there. Yes, this is Reaper from what Diana's saying. Reaper is a fantastic piece of production software. And if you watch these Song Week production videos that you're getting, I break it down quite a bit and can answer pretty much any questions about it. I've been working in Reaper now for at least a couple of years, and really started to dig into it a lot deeper over the past couple of months as I've been doing this Song Week process. So again, that takes us into the middle here.
I can't breathe.
And then we already played that, so we'll go to the chorus.
I can't breathe. I need air. I can't see. My eyes are so tired. I can't believe with all of this information that I still don't know how to live.
So that's normally where the process is starting for me, with that coming around. And from there, what happens are the drums come in. And for me, my first instrument was actually drums. So drums are normally the hardest part to get right for me. They drive me nuts. And one of the things that was particularly challenging about this track is it's the first time on one of the more rock-oriented songs that I decided to go with totally in the box drum sound. So the drum sound, which I'll add in here, was actually produced totally using Complete Instruments. It was produced using the Studio Drummers kit. So we ended up with that. So I want to break that down a little bit, and then we'll start talking about some of the effects and some of the chains that we put on the vocals and stuff. So
I can't breathe. I need air. I can't see. My eyes are so tired. I can't believe with all of this information.
So got a really nice sound in particular out of the snare there. So normally what I found in my technique in particular, again, there is no right or wrong way to mix music or to work with music, but there are some things that can make your process a lot easier. For me, and since I'm talking about both the songwriting and the production process with this, it's kind of important to say there are phases of the project for me, and this is what I've been breaking down in the videos like I did when I was coming up with the household instruments. Is for me, I try to keep those fairly distinct, although as I've become a little bit more skilled at mixing, what started to happen is those have kind of collapsed together, and I will do some pre-mixing elements as I'm writing the song, but for the most part, in my own mind, there's a distinction between, all right, I'm writing a part right now, I'm holding my bass in my hand right now, I'm playing it, I'm writing a part, I'm writing a drum part, or something like that. So, and the part where I'm like, all right, now I'm going to sit down and I'm going to balance these things out. I'm going to level these things. I'm going to work on the different effects that are going on, everything. Occasionally, I might throw a vocal effect in there, or I might work on the drums. Drums is the hardest thing to resist temptation of mixing those two worlds together, because for me, I'm such a perfectionist when it comes to how the drums sound and how drums work in the process for what I'm doing right here. So the other thing that's different is a lot of people, especially with dance music or rap music or trap or like Tony, if you don't follow Nuova on YouTube, you need to follow them. They're amazing. He does fantastic work. I love what he does over at Nuova, but with what he's doing a lot of the time, he's showing that a lot of times people just draw drums. So they'll get into their MIDI processor that they have over here, and you know, they'll just go into the track and you have your areas. So if I start working on this, I'm gonna hit my record button so you can hear that actually. So, you know, this right here is your kick track. This, oh, I have it soloed, so let me re-solo that so you can hear it. So you'll have your kick track there. And so a lot of times the way that it'll end up happening is I'm doing all this stuff manually as I'm starting. So, you know, that'll be how I start the process. So when the song is playing and I'm working with the song as part of the process, oh, I realized that drum was on the wrong monitor. So I'll show that over here. So you end up with something that looks like this, which is what's triggering your kicks and what's triggering your snares and triggering all the different stuff that you're doing as part of the process. So a lot of that shows up like this. Some people can just go in and draw these things out. For me, since I'm so used to playing physical drums when I'm playing, that's just too difficult for me to do. So one of the things that's tough about this is I'm doing it on the stream. So I'll bring this over a little bit to the keyboard. One of the things that's tough is that I actually have a delay on the stream, so it's kind of hard. So the drums aren't going to sound right when I'm playing them manually with what I'm doing here. But so I'm hearing them like quite a bit late from what's happening on the stream. So a lot of times what we'll do is this part will end up in something like this.
I can't breathe. I need air. I can't see.
My audio got garbled there for some reason. So a lot of times, again, that's what'll end up happening as part of the process there, is they'll come out in that manual part that sounds a bit like that. I'm actually going to stop and restart my stream so that way the audio is a little bit cleaner. So a lot of times it will start as a manual process like that for me at this point where
I can't breathe. I need air.
something weird is going on with my Reaper right now. So I'm trying to get that up and running again so that it's not taking up as much of the sonic space, but as I have added in more of these instruments, it's doing some wonky things to my processing, which is kind of annoying. I'll have to figure out why that's happening. But so what inevitably ends up happening, I'm getting that at this point. So what ends up happening in here is that you end up with the layers of what's happening. So I'll record my drums, then I'll go into that view that I was showing you right there, and I'll start tweaking it so that everything is even in what we're discussing here. So let me make sure that this is streaming out properly, because I was having a bit of an issue with it. All right, I think we're good now. I'm gonna shut some of this stuff down so that it's working a little bit cleaner. Hopefully it cleans up my audio here. Let's see. I'm actually gonna switch my project real quick and see if it... Yeah, it's just something with that project. That's annoying. So, sorry about that. Not sure what happened with that project that made it so challenging. Probably when I started going in and started trying to record with it on that. So if I disarm it... It's the live input at the same time as the streaming and recording that's causing it to choke a little bit. So, where you end up with on that track is something that sounds kind of mismatched, especially when it comes to the fills, because again, I'm looking for natural sounding fills in what I'm doing, because normally I would just play this stuff normally play this stuff live on a drum set. So you end up with some particulars on the drums that are really critical and that I normally will have to go in and fix, because when I'm recording them manually, what ends up happening is your fills don't sync right. They sound kind of strange. Things are weird and backwards with what's happening there. So a lot of times it comes out sounding weird, so I have to go in and I have to fix the sounds so that they sound proper in what's happening here.
How to live, I can't breathe, I need air, I can't see my...
Another couple things. Another thing about the drums on this track is because I am using a click track to make sure that everything is synced up for what I'm doing right here, but there are certain things in the song, and I noticed this, I was actually discussing it when I was talking about this song, that it's not necessarily always on perfect tempo. One thing that's really important about when you're recording the way that I'm recording, where I'm basically being a rock band myself, is it makes it really challenging to have a natural feel. If you're recording a dance song, it's normally okay for everything to be like perfectly synced and everything to be like right in line and no mistakes or errors or anything like that. But the challenge is that for a rock song, I like to have some things that are offset. So you'll notice at times when, especially when we're soloing the drums, that they don't sound like perfectly in sync. So let me play this part again. So like, when you're just hearing that, it may not sound like it's on perfect tempo, but I recorded the bass first, as I mentioned here, rather than the drums to the click track, knowing what my tempo was going to be, and brought in the drums afterwards. And that, I found, helps me create a more natural feel for what's happening with the drums, as opposed to the drums sounding like a dance tune and like they're stuck in what's happening with the dance, with the tune. I'm matching it to the bass, which gives the whole thing an overall more natural rolling feel to what's happening.
How to live, I can't breathe, I need air, I can't see, my eyes are so tired, I can't believe, with all of this information, that I still don't know how to live.
So this part of the song, which is why I keep sticking at it so much right now, the chorus part of the song, which is kind of hard to see. Typically when you start a mix, one of the things that's really important is you want to start at the portion of the song that is the loudest portion of the song. So the loudest portion of the song in this is that chorus, like especially if you, like, we'll just listen to it. If you listen to the difference between what's going on here and the chorus.
I can't breathe, I need air.
And we jump back to the verse.
My dreams are in a machine.
Much quieter. Now, one of the reasons...
Download
Now, that's much quieter, but one of the reasons that you start at the loudest point of the song, especially for me, is you're trying to create a build-up throughout the song so that the chorus, when it really hits like it is right here, and you'll hear that happen a lot in this track, that the chorus really explodes. You want that chorus to hit loud, which it definitely does in this track.
I can't breathe. I need air. I can't see. My eyes are so tired.
And you can hear it even more when we go through, like I'll give it a couple of seconds of playing the bridge in here. The bridge is a much quieter piece, or the pre-chorus as I'm calling it in this song, is a substantially quieter piece in this track.
Can't believe with all of this information that I still don't know how to live. I can't breathe.
So again, going for the big push right there. So the mixing of this song actually started for me once all the pieces were kind of recorded and finished and I knew what I was going to do as part of the process. That part of the song, you normally end up listening to it like 500 times as part of the process to make sure that everything's adequate. So that gives us the chance now to kind of break into some of what's happening here with the mix and talk a little bit about some of the decisions that I made as part of the process. One thing I always say, well, everybody says this, even if you've been mixing a long time, like some of my mentors that I follow, Tony is obviously one of them at Nuova, Produce Like a Pro. I love their videos, Musician on a Mission. There's so many great mixing tutorials you can get at the National University of YouTube that'll teach you the ins and outs of this stuff, and I've watched hundreds of hours. I try to watch something every single day that helps me improve this process, and I feel like every week that I've done the songwriting challenge, I've improved this process as well. It makes it a very interesting process. But then what ends up happening is you got to learn how to blend all of these elements together. So in this song, what we have, and I'll go through this chorus part, and we'll actually set this up to loop for a second so that it just kind of loops through this chorus, and we'll talk about each of the different parts that you have going on in here. So in here, we obviously have some vocals, so solo those.
I can't breathe. I need air.
So we got our vocals, then we got our bass. We've got a piano, which is not playing at this part. The piano part's actually earlier in the song. I could have had a piano part during this, but this already has so much that's going on, and you'll see in a second how much is going on during that chorus. But we've got the piano part was just sounding kind of muddy, and I didn't like it. One of the decisions you have to make quick, especially when you're trying to produce a song every single week, which is what I'm trying to do, and is a very difficult process in what's happening here. Oh, Tony from Nuova is in the YouTube chat. So if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure to throw him a subscribe. He's been huge for what I'm doing here. And so I very much appreciate all of his guidance and help on this stuff. But so let's move on. So one of the decisions you have to make very quickly, and what's happening is if you're turning it down so much or it's just not working, get rid of it. And in this case, I had a piano part that was playing that was pretty similar. Actually, I'll solo the part here in the second verse. So you had a similar part that was going on with that here that just wasn't working really well behind this really busy chorus. So we got our vocals, which we actually have foreground and background vocals going on. So we have our main vocal part and we have our background vocals. We have a bass. Then we have multiple string sections going on in the chorus. So going back to that chorus part, we have a violin part that's happening. We also have a low string part that's going on, a bass, it's actually a double bass that's used. So both string parts are coming from Session Strings Pro that we've got in here, and they meld really well with the bass. So I'm gonna play those two parts together. We'll bring in our bass. parts complement each other very, very, very well in what's going on in here. So then we have our drums, which I soloed before about. And then we have our guitars. And so guitars are always the most challenging thing to mix. We'll talk about these two. I actually have an acoustic and an electric guitar track that's going on to give the guitars nice body. My acoustic guitar sounds like absolute crap, which is super annoying about it. But I can use it a lot of the times. It creates a nice fullness effect that's happening in there, and gives the guitar a lot of body. And I'll show you in a second that my acoustic guitar, though, I need to put some new strings on it. It sounds like crap. I haven't played it in a long time. And during this part where there's a lot going on, there's the violin part, there's the bass strings part, and there's all the crescendo of the song going on. Again, the acoustic guitar didn't make a ton of sense to have in here, so I actually pulled that part out fully. And so we just end up with our guitar part. So we'll play that. Oops. Hold on. 1 second here. What did I solo or mute myself out? I muted myself out somehow. Let me unsolo myself here. Hold on. Stop. Let me get my track back up and running again here. Hold on. And come out and go back into it. Uh-oh. I like crashed my project here for some reason. That's always exciting. Computer problems can happen to anyone. I'm not sure why it happened on this part, but oh, I was at the very beginning. I moved my cursor. It was the easiest problem to fix. Hold on here. All right, so I'm sure I have a track soloed here somewhere. Yes, I have acoustic guitars soloed here. So let's pull those out and go to our electric guitar. So let's talk about some mixing fundamentals really quickly here and how I got that sound. Again, lots of these things are challenging to figure out. You got to make a lot of decisions on what you're doing right here. And a great fundamental tip to think about when we're talking about the mix, which I'll break down in a second, is really you've only got a couple of different resources that you can tweak. So overall, you can tweak the volume of something. So you can make it louder or you can make it quieter. And most people, when they start mixing, including myself, this was always the problem I had, is that inevitably it would just turn into a volume battle, where what I was doing was like, all right, I want my vocals to stand out, so my vocals need to be super loud, obviously, right? If I want people to be able to hear them and understand what I'm saying here, I need to turn them up. And so what ends up happening when you do that is you get into this escalating war of just constantly turning things up, which makes you make everything too loud, which means that your entire mix ends up sounding muddy and sounding like crap. So volume is just one of the tools that you have. It is important to have things be fairly balanced, but as I've matured in mixing and learned more and more about mixing, volume, actually a lot of times turning things down will allow you to make the entirety of the mix louder. So instead of turning things up to make them louder, it sounds super like counterintuitive. Oh, if I turn it up, it's going to be louder. A lot of the times turning down multiple elements so that you get more room, you get more breathing room or headroom, as engineers will call it, it makes elements of the mix you couldn't hear before stand out more, and it gives you more access to the other tools. So volume is one of your tools. The next tool that you have is EQ. And so your EQ, think of what you would have on your typical stereo. You have your bass, you have your mids, and you have your treble. Well, you obviously have tools that are way more complex than that and what you can do on a track like this and what you can do in a production suite like Reaper. So your EQ is the next tool that you have that can make things stand out. So rather than just working on volume, you can cut things into certain ranges. So there are lots of helpful resources. I'll share some of the ones that I've used if people are interested in them. Just leave those notes in the chat. But there are lots of ways to think about what should sit where. Like your vocals, for the most part, are going to sit in the high mid to the high range. Your piano is going to be mostly in the mid with maybe a little sparkle on the high end. Your bass and your drums, for the most part, are going to be in the low range. And so thinking about that, EQ is a tool that you can use to position things in the mix. Then from there, we've got panning. So for guitars in particular, when I play this track, the idea is to make these guitars as loud as we can. as part of the process here to make them loud, but an electric guitar, when you turn it way up, just dominates the mix. And especially the vocals, a very loud and out of control electric guitar will basically take the vocals out entirely. You won't be able to hear them. You also will have struggle with your snare cutting through and all of those things and what's happening here. So panning, which is your left and right speakers, is a great tool that you can use to make the guitars kind of get out of the way from that perspective, but also sound a heck of a lot thicker. And so with electric guitars, my technique, and you see this with a lot of people, is to take my guitar tracks. Sometimes I'll record tracks for both sides. You can do it manually, but a lot of times what I'll do, and what I did in this case, because again, with time, is I copied the guitar track. So there are 2 guitar tracks in here, if we look at them for each part. And then I panned one hard left and one hard right. So when you listen to the guitar, we've soloed it here. That one will just come up. That one will just come through your left. Then this one will just come through your right. With all of this. And so when you blend those together, you get a much wider effect. Your guitar sounds much bigger, and then combined with your EQ and combined with your other tools, it creates something that's much more interesting and wider in what you're doing in the mix, which again, when you're balancing your volume and you're balancing your EQ and you're balancing your panning, those 3 elements combined can help a lot of instruments, like what's happening in this case. There's a lot going on from a tracks perspective. They can stand out much more easily for that reason. And so in this case, we've widened those and brought those in. So when we look again at all the instruments we have going on, we have vocals, we have bass, we have piano, we have the strings parts, we have drums, we have acoustic and electric guitar that are happening in here. We end up with a very busy mix. And so I mentioned the 3 fundamentals. You got your volume, you got your EQ, you got your panning, and then finally you can start to get into your effects. And so you've got delays, you've got reverb, you got saturation, you've got distortion, you've got compression fits under volume, which I can talk about at another time. Compression is more of an advanced concept, and I know a lot of people watching these may not be at that. I can certainly talk about that a little bit in future streams for people that are interested in it. But again, that's a factor of volume, which allows a busy mix with tons of stuff going on, like what's happening in this, to continue.
I can't breathe. I need air. I can't see. My eyes are so tired. I can't believe with all of this information that I still don't know how to live.
All right, so we've got that in there. So let's talk a little bit about the mix as a whole. So again, when I'm doing a whole mix, I'm starting in that busy chorus part, and generally there's an order that makes this easier. And that order for me, and this again can be different for everybody. Some people mix in different ways. Some people start in different places. Some people start listening to the whole thing. One of the rules that I've heard that I believe to be true is you always want to make sure that you're listening to the whole mix. You don't want to go, all right, I'm going to work on the vocals and then just solo the vocals
I can't breathe.
and start just working on the vocals. Because then when you unmute them, you might find that they don't fit in the mix at all, or they don't work. You go, oh crap, those don't fit at all.
I can't breathe.
But you'll notice in this, I was doing the best I can to balance all of those instruments, because we have so much that's going on during that track and so many subtle things that are happening. We've really got to be balancing these things as we go along. But for me, my order generally starts with, I'll work on the kick drum first. So in this case, the kick drum, I want to make sure that it's loud enough. I want to make sure that I'm getting enough punch out of it. And so kick drums are complex because they need to do 2 things. First of all, your kick drum holds down the low end. It's the bass along with the bass guitar if you have a bass in it, or a bass synth, whatever you have going on in there. And so your kick's really important. You want it, and depending on the theme of the song, this is a rock song, so you want it to have plenty of boom. And if we're doing rap or trap or EDM or hip hop or something here, it would need to have way more boom or way more sub. In this case, since there's so much occupying the sonic space, I don't want too much boom so that it's taking away. But you want it to have plenty of boom, or your sub that sits under it, and you want it to have plenty of punch as well. So one of the techniques that I use for that a lot of times is I will use what's called a kick crush, which you basically, with your kick, we have this. Kind of your standard kick that you've got going on there. Got plenty of boom. Sounds kind of muffled. Doesn't sound super impressive on its own. And then what I'll do is I'll route this from that track. So I'll do some routing so that I'm sending that kick over to what's called a crush. And on this, and a crush means what I'm doing is I'm compressing it very heavily, which means I want the volume to stay very tight on this thing. And I'm cutting out, oddly enough, the low end. So in the EQ, if we pull this up here, I'm cutting out the low end, and I'm adding a crap ton of high end to it. So this kick on its own sounds like absolute crap. If we listen to it, it's very high, it's kind of nasally, but when we add it in with these, what happens is it allows the punch of the kick to cut through the mix. And so that way you can hear the kick in relation to the other instruments. It has enough punch and boom so that it sounds well enough to cut through both. So in this case, that's what I did to make the kick stand out. And then there's some further stuff I'll talk about that's a bit more advanced in a second.
I can't breathe. I need air.
So in this case, making sure that the kick is moving the speakers in the way that I want it to, making sure the kick has plenty of sub, plenty of punch, and what it's doing here. I'm just checking my chat real quick to make sure that I can see if anybody's talking or if anybody has any questions. Happy to answer those here. But anyway, so making sure that all those things are cutting through the mix. And then I'm doing something that's called side chaining. So a compressor, the job of a compressor, I mentioned it earlier, is to turn things down. And for the most part, what it's doing is it's looking for things that are loud. So we'll pull up our bass track here, or actually vocals might be a better example, but we'll pull up our bass track here. And so our audio is represented by this. Let me go over here. Our audio is represented by this. So when we're over here, you can see this waveform that's right here, and this is our audio. Actually, I recorded this pretty evenly, so you're not going to see a ton of peaks. Actually, it might be better to look at a vocal. Let's look at a vocal instead, where, yeah, this is a much better example. We'll look at our vocal right here, especially with this vocal. So when we look at this vocal right here, you'll notice that there are quiet areas in here, like tiny areas in the mix. Let me fold this down so I can get it even a little bit bigger. There we go. So you'll see that there are tiny areas in the mix right here, which are quieter parts. And you see this like big spike right here, that big spike.
This information that I still don't know
Is me really emphasizing a note when I'm singing it hard. I sing that note a lot harder, so it's louder, because when I was singing it into the mic, it's louder than this part. Well, the problem is, if I turn the volume on all this up at the same time, what happens is that this is now super loud. It's loud to the point where it's distorting and sounds gross and disgusting, which we don't want. And then this next part here is getting up to that volume that we want, and then this part sounding gross. So that's where a compressor comes in. What a compressor does is it helps even this out. So actually, if you looked at a printed piece of audio, it would look a lot more like this, where it's pretty even across the board. There aren't many spikes. But what it's doing, the way it does that is it turns things down. So what it will do is on this bigger part of the wave right here, it will bring in these louder parts so that they're not as loud. And it does all of it essentially automatically. It detects it and goes, oh, that part is too loud, we're gonna turn it down, which evens everything out and then allows you to turn things up so that the volume sounds more even. So a lot of people make the mistake of thinking, oh, a compressor is to make things louder. And it does, in effect, do that, but it does it actually by making things quieter. And I'd mentioned that rule earlier where I was saying it's important to know that a lot of times to make things louder in general, you have to turn stuff down. The same thing is true with this compressor right here to make these things more even. So the same thing is happening with a sidechain compressor, but what a sidechain compressor is doing is I'm sending signal from this kick drum, which we heard earlier. We'll hear it again. Let me go back into our chorus. And what I'm doing is I'm sending signal into my bass. And so my bass is listening, which I'll show you right here, for that kick drum to hit. And what it's doing is when it notices that the kick drum is hitting, it backs down the bass a little bit. And we can see the volume being turned down right here. So it's backing it down by about 4 dB or 4 decibels when the kick drum sounds. Now, you'll notice that the part isn't exactly playing the same as what the kick drum is doing, which is fine for this part. When it's mixed with the whole track, that's fine. It doesn't necessarily have to be perfect. But the idea is when the kick hits, you can still hear it hit throughout the entirety of the track. Instead of just hearing, I'm gonna turn up my brightness a little bit. Instead of just hearing the kick part or having to turn it up really loud, or the bass part having to turn that up really loud, what is done there is that the bass backs down when the kick hits. And so that's called side chaining. The bass is listening for the kick to hit, and when it hits, the bass turns down and gets out of the way a little bit. So in effect, what happens is when the whole track is active here, you can hear the kick drum.
I can't breathe. I need air. I can't see my eyes.
So the kick drum is standing out without having to just turn it up and have it be muddy at the same time. And it's doing it in a way that's kind of neat, where automatically the bass is listening, the bass hears, okay, the kick drum's going off, and this happens in a matter of milliseconds, and that is then turning the bass down a little bit for, a fraction of a second, sometimes a little longer, a second, so that everything stands out. I'm doing the same thing with the guitar. The guitar, less so. The guitar, I'm not turning it down quite as much, but again, I did it enough so that you can hear the kick drum and you can hear the song pushing through the speakers when those hits come in.
I can't breathe. I need air. I can't see. My eyes are so tired.
So a lot happening there. That's one of the techniques. And then on my kick drum, I'm just using one of the techniques that I use. Again, it works for me. People will ask the questions all the time about mixing. Really, it's about finding what sounds good and listening more so than it is about listening to what everybody says about it. But the technique that I found that works the best, so when I'm talking about a chain, I'm talking about the different effects that I have on my kick drum right here. And I have that crush kick drum that I'm talking about as well, that we have here that's doing certain things. But this kick drum right here has an EQ on it where I'm cutting off the high end a little bit. Now, I left quite a bit of high end on this kick drum, and this was me just listening to the sound and saying, when I cut too much of the high end off of it, it sounded a bit too boomy, especially when I was sending it through the crash. So I cut some high end off of it, but not a ton. I like to have some high end on it so that I'm getting enough of the punch sound that I was hoping to get from it, so that it still continues to cut through. And so that's there. Then there's a compressor on it. My compressor of choice I've been using these days comes as part of Komplete. It's called Supercharger. So this is what's listening to make sure if there's anything that's going too loud so that I can keep everything at kind of a uniform volume. This compressor also has some fun features on it. It has saturation on it, which allows us to create a bit more of a distorted effect. And it also has this character knob on it that I like, which works really well. It has a fat, a warm, and a bright setting on it. And so for your kicks and your basses, you normally are gonna want that fat setting, which just makes it sound boomier and wider. But this can be used on a variety of different things. But this tool came with Komplete, and I really enjoy it. It's pretty much my go-to compressor right now because it has some nice effect to it. And then afterwards, once before I noticed that I did my cut before the compressor, there are some boosts that happen afterwards. Actually, I cut again on this particular one. So you'll see my EQ a little bit here. I cut a little more high end after the compressor because it was a bit too high. Like I wanted it to have the punch before it went into the compressor, but afterwards there was a bit too much, so I cut some more off. And then I carved out some particular space for the kick in this range, which again is me listening specifically to what sounded good with it compared to the bass on the sound. So when I compare this EQ to what's happening with the bass, let me find my bass folder here, to where I boosted the bass is a little bit low, was sounding a little bit better in the sub range. So when I put these two next to each other, I'm gonna make my screen a little bigger. So when I put these two next to each other, they are overlapping some similar space, but to give space where it sounded good to have the kick standing out and the bass holding its own, the kick actually worked a little bit higher between this 100 and 200 range, and the bass was sounding a little better with the boost a little bit lower. Now, some of these frequencies are not necessarily audible to the human ear, but I was scanning through and listening to where these two could have some EQ space that sounded good. The bass also had some really gross sounds here in the 300 range that I took out, and the bass I also cut off a ton of that end. But what I'm showing here is that each have their own space in the mix, and what I'm doing here with the kick and the bass. So
I can't breathe. I need air. I can't see. My eyes are so tired.
So, as you can hear, lots going on in this track, lots of drama. In particular, I love string instruments, so there's great string parts. One of the things I'm working on, there's never really a digital replacement for certain types of instruments. Whoops, I didn't mean to close that. There's never really a replacement for certain types of instruments. I mean, obviously it would be better if I had a violinist recording those parts or a double bass on those parts, but I do the best I can to use the articulations in Session Strings to get them where I want, and they sound great within the track, so that makes me happy.
I can't breathe. I need air. I can't see. My eyes are so tired.
So we got that in there. So vocals, let's talk about that a little bit. So with the vocals, pretty simple setup on the vocals here. For the most part, most of my compression work is happening on the master vocal send, or the master vocal folder here. So in Reaper, your folders are your master sends for each thing. So all my vocals are going into one track that's called the folder, which is, basically the master vocal channel. And then there's a lot of the heavy lifting is happening on the EQ here, but there are some interesting things going on at certain parts with the vocals. So one of the parts that I like to point out here is at the beginning. So I'm gonna get off my screen for a second and show this larger. So there's a vocal intro high, which is this track. There's a vocal intro low, so these are natural vocals. So those are natural parts. Then there's this one in here that's called Weird Tune that I created. So this has a pitch effect on it where I took it down 7 semitones and created this really weird kind of giant-y sounding effect that's going on. Oh, you almost can't hear it here when it's running through this, because all three are running through the same reverb, but I don't want to turn this up too much. Let me see. We'll just turn it up. We'll turn it up this way so I know I can turn it back. It's almost very hard to hear because I turned it down because that's what's affecting what's running into the reverb. So there's this really unnatural, like, mountain giant effect that's going on in the background of this that is not natural singing. It's lower than I can sing, but it sounds very strange. So our 3 vocal tracks, our intro high, our low, and our weirdo vocals are all running into a reverbs unit. So I use a send for reverb, which is right here. It's my vocal intro send, or intro reverb that's happening here. I'm using a complete reverb that's called RC48 here, and I'm trying to create this big lost sound, which in this is called looped verb. And then one of the things that I found and help that I've received from people on the other end is that a lot of times your reverb creates havoc in your EQ that you've got right here, and this reverb in particular creates a ton of undesirable low end and bass that I didn't like. So I cut a ton of low end off of this all the way up to 200 to keep that from getting out of control on this reverb part. So if we solo it. Dreams in the machine. Now, the vocal effects during the... So we'll go through the strings part at the beginning. So this strings part in the transition right here. So it's using the twill effect on there that comes with Session Strings Pro, which are the strings that I'm using that creates that kind of neat little transition effect that I'm creating there. And then the vocal effects for the verses and for everything else are different effect. I didn't want that huge lost effect, but that huge lost effect actually makes a return. Before I play the rest of it, the huge lost effect makes a return here in the chorus. I wanted to bring it back later in the song, and it kind of does so. Someone described it when they were listening to it in Song a Week as demonic. I don't know that it's that demonic, but it's not only is that vocal effect with the weird low end and the big loss sound there, but it's moving between your speakers with pan when you hear it in this. So pay attention to how it's moving between your speakers.
How to live.
Make a return, even though it's not the effect that I'm using for the entire song that's in here, as you'll hear when you listen to the verse.
My dreams are in a machine.
So you notice those are sending to a channel. It's called verse reverb here, which is right here. Same thing is happening. These reverbs all create a lot of nasty low end, so I take that out. And this, I'm using a different effect that's just called rich verb in here, tweaked a little bit to my liking. So if you listen to just the reverb,
assemble my life from a template of a man to whom I relate.
I did mention there was acoustic guitar in this song. As I said, the acoustic guitar sounds like absolute crap because my strings are bad, but it's here. It's here in the background, and actually I turned it down quite a bit, but it's there. So you can hear the acoustic crappy guitar in all its glory. And you can hear how awful those string sounds are. So those string sounds are horrible, and but it's there. And I just mostly wanted it for the strumming effect that you can hear behind the rest of the verse.
My dreams are in a machine, downloading home to a factory. Assemble my life from a template of a man.
And the acoustic guitar does stick around through the verse part, even when the electric comes in. I'd mentioned earlier in this, I know some of you didn't see that part, that the chorus, obviously I wanted to be the loudest part. So the electric guitar does start with the second verse, but it's much quieter than it is in the later verses. Even though it still is very present and very audible, it's mixed in with acoustic guitar and it's turned down. I didn't want this part to be quite as loud as the other parts.
Lost in a wave of technology, dead to the world outside of me, living in a cold.
Ooh, there's the acoustic guitar sounding nice and crappy. It's the same part, it sounds awful.
I can't breathe, I need air.
During this part, we still have quite a bit going on, more focused around the strings and the vocals with the background vocals. So we still have our violin and our string. Basically that I would be soloing the whole part. They're all going on there. So you have 2 string parts and you have bass and you have 2 vocal parts.
I can't breathe. I need air. I can't see.
And then finally, as we get to the end, there's that big transition which takes us into another part. As I mentioned, for those of you that have been following the Silence Noise music or you're interested in it, this song, when I was writing it, felt very linked to another Silence Noise song that's called My Feet in the Mud that I wrote about 4 weeks ago, 4 or 5 weeks ago now, My Feet in the Mud. And so the end of this song actually goes from being in the key of this song. So it starts in a D sharp. I believe this D sharp is the song, is the theme, or is the key of this song. I'm not a music theory person. I don't know it very well. So don't ask music theory questions. I have lots of relatives that can teach you about music theory though. But it does go into the matching key of My Feet in the Mud for this final break, which again is very heavy and kind of also lyrically linked to what's happening in My Feet in the Mud.
So much but care so little, always searching for the newest arrival. My mind is full of clicks and buzzes, wishing I could ever fall asleep again. The day I waited for so long seems like it has come and gone.
So what's going on there? This part at the end actually even calls back to
For so long, I've waited for so long, I've waited for so long. Now I want to give up on this dream. Now I'm fully part of the machine.
which that transition is the same one from My Feet in the Mud. So this song is called Factory of Hope, which I had up there. Factory of Hope is available on my SoundCloud. I posted it earlier on this page earlier in the week. I'm about to post it on YouTube for those of you who might be watching it there. And I'll be adding this over the next couple of days to Spotify and all this stuff. Since this is a new one, it takes a little bit longer to get out to all the music services. And I like to make any final tweaks. I don't like to launch it to Google Play or Spotify or any of those things before I can adjust and make some changes. So that song's called Factory of Hope. Let's talk about the other two very quickly. So I was sick for the past couple of weeks, getting over some sinus bronchitis stuff, which is unfortunate for me, and so I still wanted to get some stuff done. So the previous 2 weeks' themes, we had distortion and we had analog, and so I wrote 2 instrumentals, both of which again started as kind of humming parts. My voice was all messed up because I couldn't really sing that much. And so these were very simple, and for the most part were written on my phone. I have an app on my phone that's called SoundCamp that allows me to do some humming and do some other stuff and kind of convert it into music or write little parts around it with beats and all that stuff. And so in here there is the song that's called Virus, which I was focused on distortion elements through this. So this is a bit more simple. There's some synth parts, some high synth parts, some low synth parts. There's some basic drums, and there's a piano part that pops up during the middle. So all the synths in this track are analog synths that come from Digital Machines. Is a synth rig that comes with Complete. So it's synths from the 80s, lots of goofy synths. This is all working off of actually these are all off of FM8, pardon me. This is it's Mechanism that's an analog synths. I forgot this. These are all FM8 songs very heavily, or FM8 sounds very heavily modified and adjusted to be customized for what I was doing for this track. Same thing working with some panning here. The high part is panned pretty far to the left over here, and the lower part is panned to the right, so it's giving it kind of a wider effect. Both of those instruments have quite a bit of panning effect on them as well, so the instruments are moving through the space, so you can kind of feel or hear them moving along with the notes as well. But their home is on the left and the right to make this mix seem quite a bit louder. The thing to me that was the most interesting about this track is there are quite a few tempo and transition changes in this, and time changes. So the song starts at 100 BPM, and then it moves to 100 BPM, and then it slows down in the middle over the course of that transition to 80 BPM, which is kind of fun. So the whole time the track is getting slower, and then it speeds way back up. So there's a bunch of distortion with time that's happening in this track. And here you have your big synth pad that shows up in here. And there's your slowdown, so the song gradually slows down and goes into this really dramatic piano part here. Since the punchy synths were part of so much of the sound of the song earlier, I can speak English, the song earlier, I decided to focus this part more around having the pads and the piano working together. So this song's going to move from that into a really fast part. And then at the end, I literally push it up to the fastest tempo you can go. So this part was repeated quite a bit. If I were to blow this all out, the song would probably be about 5 or 6 minutes long. It's all the same part that's happening right there. But again, I was playing games with time on this song, and so you get a much faster part. There's a lot more noise that starts showing up later in this track. That's some dirty noise right there, friends. A lot of times noise is an element I like to use. I mean, it probably speaks to the type of music that I like. I like a lot of industrial and electronic music, so a lot of times kind of these atonal noises or these weird tones will show up in music because, again, I'm not always looking for the most harmonic things to be happening in my piece. And in this one, since I was speeding it up and creating this kind of chaos effect at the end of it, I really went for a lot of loud noises. And on this, there is an absolute ton of distortion that's going on this synth. There's 2 distortion units, one that's called Driver, and the other is just a manual distortion unit that comes with Reaper, and some crazy ping pong pan that's going on that's making this go back and forth like crazy. So lots of crazy distortion. And so then this leads to the big crescendo at the end, which is me exploding thing. Oh, John's here. Welcome. Loud noises. Yes, exactly. Loud noises are right here. This part right here is the fun part of being at max tempo. That piece is called Virus. You can find it as well on SoundCloud. I posted that quite a bit earlier, and what was being said there. Oh, hold on. I'm checking my comments. I do see that John also had one. Oh, Julia, welcome. So, yes, lots of descent into loud noises. This was written in kind of the first peak of me being really sick. So, this is basically how I was feeling. Like, lots of slowing down from being sick, you know, that feeling of getting super slow, and then getting my energy back, then feeling chaotic. So that's called Virus. You can find it on my SoundCloud. I'm not going to publish that one on Spotify and YouTube and all that other stuff. Or it will be on YouTube, just not Spotify and iTunes and all that other stuff. This other one, the last piece I'm going to talk about today, I know I've spent a lot more time than I was expecting to, but there's a lot to talk about with the track that I was just doing today, or with Factory of Hope. There's so much going on in it. So this is called Mechanism. So this track actually started, the theme on this was analog, so I focused on using all analog instruments, and during that time I had stumbled upon on my phone a recording of Alexander Graham Bell's assistant talking about Alexander Graham Bell's invention of the telephone. And so that sounds like absolutely awful, and what we have in here. It sounds absolutely awful and is difficult to understand, and so I didn't really focus on making it more interesting to understand. Instead, what I did for the most part was I really went through, I'm fixing my camera because I see I'm really in the dark right now because the sun went down. Oh, let me fix myself. There we go. So I went through the part of the process to really distort and make this sound kind of nasty. So it starts with this. So this is probably one of the first recordings ever in the history of recording that I used to get this, but it was just an interesting historical piece to tie into this track. As you can see, I labeled it very cleverly as weird phone quote. You can also tell I was quite sick, so I wasn't spending much time on my tablet or on the computer to do this, so this is not as neatly organized and labeled as most of my other stuff. I'm just like, throw some tracks in here and make some noise and make it sound like something. There's one marker in here that's unlabeled. I did very good, but that's really where everything else comes in. So all the synths that were used on this are analog synthesizers. They're from a synth called Retro Machines, and Retro Machines is focused on classic synthesizers from the 70s and 80s. So like the earliest types of synths that you could buy were what were covered here. Very ugly sounding drum kit, kind of intentionally because it fit the rest of the fit of the song. So two very short things. Again, both of those came from my phone, came from being sick. We're kind of organized that way. Both are like, one's a minute and a half and the other is something like something much less than that. So anyway, check those out. You got Virus, you got Mechanism. Oh, you know what I realized is I probably wasn't playing the actual audio on those. Huzzah! Because I forgot to stop my my track on this one. So, yes, we had different audio that was playing on those. That's not playing. So check out Mechanism, Virus. Those were the two other ones that are posted here. I'll post the links to all these things here with the Facebook Live. Let me go back and do what I was doing here again. My bad. We'll talk about this really quick. So I'll do this quickly.
utilizing the fact that a Q3 will vibrate anti-radiation contact would then correspondingly thermalize the process. So, to be able to talk by telegraph, it was the first real sound that had ever been transmitted to a nuclear by electricity, and we were sure that the same mechanism.
So that's your mechanism right there, and all the stuff that we had going on for that. And then the other one was Virus, which again, you can find those on my SoundCloud. I'll do the same little breakdown I just did with the different synths here. Let me get this so that it's playing. So loud noises here. Those are the 3 songs from the most recent Song a Week. This week's Song a Week theme, which I haven't talked about a ton, is minor. So it's songs that are written in the minor key that are coming this week. I have not yet started working on an idea, but when I do, I'm hoping to be out a bit more often live this week to break down my thought process and talk a bit more about the songwriting and the other pieces of the song here. But this was a fun session today. I know there was a lot to discuss with Factory of Hope and a lot going on there, so hopefully this wasn't too boring for some of you. And if you like this, again, subscribe, like, please share Silence Noise music with your friends, with your peeps, especially Factory of Hope, the new release this week. Check it out on SoundCloud, silencenoise.com. It's also, all the stuff is always available there, and you can find a playlist that you can share when you introduce to other people that gives kind of the 5 or 6 most recent tracks in order for people to kind of get into what we're doing here. That's already been updated. TheSilenceNoise.com, The Silence Noise on Facebook, The Silence Noise on SoundCloud, everywhere, Spotify, Google Play, iTunes. Share the music if you like it with others, and I will be back for future sessions. Hope you enjoyed. See you all very soon for this week's